Welcome to APUSH. Today we're going to look at the way that the political system adapted to the growing challenges provided during the Gilded Age and with growing industrialization. So here are your objectives for our study and just brief overview of what I'm calling industrial politics. Obviously, the growth of cities is going to lead to the creation of some significantly new challenges for Americans, and our previous, somewhat undeveloped political system is not necessarily going to be able to adapt to all of those new challenges. So what we're going to see is an incredibly corrupt but also somewhat effective political system sort of emerge organically that both solves the problems of growing urban cities, but also creates a whole new host of problems that may or may not be worse than the original problems that the system was facing. So if that seems complicated, let's dive into, again, the world of Gilded Age politics. So, urban political machines are the basic political organizations designed to win elections within urban areas. In the general, they are these hierarchical systems with city bosses, usually from one political party, running a major city, then ward bosses controlling large areas, and then sort of workers and captains going out and being the forces on the ground, the ones who actually connect with voters. And it's this system that replaces any sense of like bureaucratic municipal government. And so if you want something done, you go talk to your local worker, who talks to the ward boss, who talks to the city boss, who, if he thinks it's in his best interest, might try to help you and provide some services for you. In the end, the city bosses control this through massive amounts of money that they usually steal from the taxpayers and then to some degree dole back out to the taxpayers if, again, they think it serves their political interest. So money is at the center of these urban political machines. The other piece that keeps these political machines in power is massive amounts of voter fraud. Because these political bosses control the voting apparatus and control the poll workers and have all of these sort of quote unquote troops that they can send out to do their bidding, they're pretty comfortable winning the elections. And the bosses are rarely the source of political power, but they still control who gets elected to these offices. The most famous urban political boss was William Marcy Tweed of New York City. He would control New York City from about the 1850s up through the 1870s when he finally fell from power. Here's Boss Tweed in a photograph. And as I noted before, he was rarely actually in control of New York City, despite the fact that he and his kingdom, which was known as Tammany Hall, named after the public building in which they met, they controlled New York City, and he was a state senator. So he would never actually get elected, but some sort of figurehead leader would get elected, and then they would, of course, do exactly what Boss Tweed wanted them to do. Here is Tammany Hall itself, the building that they were named for. And this political machine would control New York City all the way through the 1930s, although, of course, Boss Tweed would be long gone by that point. So how did these political machines stay in power? Well, they garnered votes by providing needed services to people. Urban cities at this time were incredibly difficult, dangerous places. They were incredibly messy and dirty, and there were very few protections for workers. And so there were a lot of people who were suffering and in need. And so if something goes wrong, this is from the famous account of political machines, Plunkett of Tammany Hall, which hopefully you read in your document, or you will read in your document. But it lays out the basic arrangement, in that these political bosses provide money to help people in need, and in exchange, they expect you to show up and vote, or more accurately, show up and vote multiple times. They also target specifically newly arrived immigrants, and this, of course, is accounted for by the fact that there were no real citizenship rules or requirements. And so the moment someone got off of the boat from wherever they came from, the first person they run into would be a representative of the political machine who would get them signed up as a citizen, get them registered to vote on whatever their political party was, and then probably provide them with, find some housing and maybe even find a job for them, with the idea being that then they would create this lasting sense of loyalty within the community that they could call upon later for when they needed votes. So these political bosses, again, protected huge groups of people, and in exchange, these people would vote for them, and they would look the other way when these political machines pocketed ridiculous amounts of money at the taxpayer's expense. This massive corruption was at the heart of these political machines. So on the one hand, you have the social safety net and the providing services for immigrants. On the other hand, you have significant violence against any political rivals who dare to show their face. You have, of course, the control over the court system. Here is the Tammany Hall tiger. The symbol of Tammany Hall was a tiger, and here it is mauling Lady Liberty. And of course, you have massive theft and graft, the idea that these political machines would buy and sell public lands at huge markups. They would overbid for projects and then pocket the money. So for example, the budget for a new courthouse in New York City would balloon to upwards of $50 million, with the vast majority of that money being pocketed by political operatives and contractors along the way. So they have people overbid for projects, and then they'd pocket the excess money. All of this, of course, worked for a time, but the corruption and specifically the lack of the corrupt elections really started to rankle people over time. And so there were some groups of people who pushed back against these machines. For example, civil service reform was an attempt to control the power of political machines, with the basic idea being if public servants have to take a basic competency test and they're somewhat given a job based on merit, then you don't have the type of patronage, the gifts and the spoils that these political machines rely on. You also see politicians like Robert La Follette of Wisconsin, who propose more democratic proposals like the referendum and the recall. The referendum is citizens voting on laws before they go onto the books. Initiative is where citizens could actually propose laws, simply bypassing the legislature and then voting on them directly. And then recall is pulling corrupt officials out of office. And so politicians like Wisconsin's Bob La Follette saw more direct democracy as the answer, whereas political cartoonists like Thomas Nast saw revealing corruption as the answer. Thomas Nast was one of the most famous cartoonists in American history, and he is going to bring down Boss Tweed through purely political cartoons. So here we see Boss Tweed and his cronies feasting on the corpse of New York City. Here we see Boss Tweed trying to indoctrinate the children of New York City with new educational curriculum. And here we see Boss Tweed and his cronies trying to pass the buck as far as the question of who took the people's money. And so through these cartoons, Thomas Nast was able to build popular support against Boss Tweed. And Tweed famously tried to shut down Thomas Nast, claiming that these pictures were defaming him by portraying him as a thief and corrupt, which, kind of was. In the end, Boss Tweed gets arrested for his illegal activities and specifically for tax evasion. He's brought down by the governor of New York, Samuel Tilden, who then gets the moniker Honest Sam Tilden. And for his trouble, he's going to get defeated by Ulysses Grant or by Rutherford B. Hayes in the election of '76, which again, as you remember from last unit, was one of the most corrupt elections in American history. So that's his reward for helping to bring down Boss Tweed. But it did slow down the Tammany machine for a while. Here's the Tammany machine being blown up by Samuel Tilden. But it turns out Boss Tweed may have been too big to jail, metaphorically, and he ended up bribing his way out of city jail, and then he was arrested again, and then he was able to bribe his way out again, and then eventually he fled the country and I think ended up in Spain somewhere. So he wasn't able to stay as boss of this political machine forever, but he was able to have enough connections to break himself out of prison. So Boss Tweed, everybody. In the end, the political parties did sort of try to take on reform of these machines, but the problem is, as Samuel Tilden discovered, when you try to take on these political machines and you try to take on patronage, it can come back to bite you. And so the Republicans got really hurt by their reliance on patronage in the years right after the Civil War. Here we see Chester A. Arthur making it rain with government jobs, metaphorically, of course. And so the Republican Party, in the end, divided up into two factions, the stalwarts and the half-breeds. The stalwarts were led by Roscoe Conkling of New York, who we mentioned before, whereas the half-breeds were led by James Blaine, who was the hopelessly corrupt senator from Maine. And it's ironic that this lists the half-breeds as the less corrupt of the two, because I guess sort of, but in the end, it was much more a battle of personalities between Conkling and Blaine. And so when Conkling's faction was pushed out in the aftermath of the Arthur presidency, Blaine got the nomination, but he was then defeated by Grover Cleveland. So in the end, when you try to do any type of civil service reform, it usually comes back to hurt you. And so another example of this was Grover Cleveland, in the end, did not fully support Tammany Hall. And so Tammany Hall turned on him in the election of '88, which we talked about yesterday. And so Grover Cleveland, because he lost his home state of New York, mostly because the Tammany machine turned against him, ended up losing the election. I mean, it was also, of course, because industrialists threw massive amounts of money behind Benjamin Harrison because of the tariff issue, but also partially because of Tammany Hall. And so the lesson that we all learned here is you don't mess with corruption. You don't mess with political machines. If you try to reform this stuff, you're going to get kicked out of office. So why don't we just sacrifice the sacrificial lamb of reform to the altar of patronage, enjoy the fact that life is relatively good for most people at this point, and go on being hopelessly corrupt. So here's your objectives on a very inspiring lesson of American industrial politics.